Hello and welcome to Contrast Media. I'm Patryk Witkowski,
And I'm Ben Francis.
and today we'll be discussing the controversy unfurling around Georgia's recent election and the geopolitical implications of the region. Over to you, Ben.
So, Georgia, the country bordering Russia and not the US state, has had national elections at the end of October. And these elections have served as the latest battleground in the emerging Cold War between Russia and the West. For decades since the end of the Soviet Union, Georgia has been slowly moving towards the West and away from Russia, with its process accelerating in the early 2000s with the rise of a very pro-Western government, which triggered a short war with Russia and subsequently Russian troops occupying two Georgian territories. But in the last few years, the Georgian government, led by the political party Georgian Dream, has been resisting Western pressure, and this has been creating a lot of tension within the country. Due to both the strong anti-Russian sentiment among the population and the large amount of influence Western nations have on Georgian civil society, media, and politics. This tension really started after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, when Georgia refused to enact sweeping sanctions against Russia or send weapons to Ukraine. The government in Georgia did vote to condemn the invasion at the United Nations and demand an immediate withdrawal of Russian troops, but went no further than this. This response from the Georgian government was actually pretty normal in a global context, where a big majority of countries, 141, voted to condemn the invasion, but only 33, mostly in NATO, actually sent weapons to Ukraine and enacted sweeping sanctions. However, despite this, many in the West saw this as a pro-Russian stance, and this has led to a growing opposition toward the Georgian government by much of Western leadership. In fact, despite the Georgian government pushing for EU membership, the European Union has stated that in order for Georgia to progress with the EU accession process, it must enact a set of political change, with increased antagonism towards Russia being at the heart of those changes. This tension came to a head earlier this year when the government passed a foreign agents bill that forced non-government organizations, or NGOs, and media companies to register as foreign agents if they received more than 20% of their funding from any foreign country. The Georgian government claimed this was to counter the high level of influence foreign countries had on Georgian politics through these organizations, and just for context, Georgia is a relatively poor country and has one of the largest NGO sectors in the world, which is mostly owned and funded by Western states and companies. So that sector, of course, has a lot of power in the country through its influence. However, Western leaders and media outlets argued that this foreign agents bill was an authoritarian crackdown and cynically being used by the government to remove opposition, and even that it was pro-Russian. This is despite the fact that it also applies to Russian NGOs, in theory at least. Following the bill's passing, the opposition and Georgian civil society, which is largely driven by these NGOs, organized mass street protests against the government. Many opposition figures openly called for the overthrow of the government, and there were reports by the government of a failed coup attempt, which has happened before in Georgia's post-Soviet history in the Rose Revolution in 2003, so it's not too unprecedented. So anyway, with that build-up, the election was held at the end of October, and the official results declared Georgian Dream had won about 55% of the vote, a 5% increase from the last Georgian national elections. However, both the current governing Georgian Dream and the opposition have both claimed victory. In fact, 3 different exit polls were released on the day of the election, showing different results. The 2 pro-opposition polls both showed the government losing out to the opposition coalition, but the poll conducted by a government-friendly organization showed the government winning with a similar vote share to what they received in the election, according to the government. Obviously, both sides have an incentive to claim victory, as the country is very polarized, and this contested result has triggered unrest with mass protests following calls by Georgia's pro-Western president for people to come to the streets to oppose the election results. Several countries have stepped in to support the Georgian government's claim of victory, including Russia, but also many neutral states in the Ukraine war, like Hungary and bordering Turkey, as well as even states like Poland. While on the other side, the EU, Germany, United States, and many Western nations have released statements condemning the election to various extents, with all four opposition parties in Georgia, which ran against the government in the election and the president, calling the election stolen and a, quote, special Russian operation. However, the charge of the vote not being free and fair is quite contentious. There have been many reports of issues and intimidating at some polling stations, as well as a video of somebody running into a polling station and stuffing ballots into a ballot box. Just how widespread, though, this was in the election is not yet clear, with the government claiming every election had irregularities and the opposition arguing that no, there's too many irregularities and it basically consisted of it resulted in the vote being stolen. In response, the government conducted a recount of 14% of the ballots, and the emerging consensus among international observers seems to be that the election was fought on an uneven playing field, and the government used its power to influence the public, but that the voting procedure and process was generally free and fair, and voters had a wide range of choice. So, just moving forward, Patryk, how do you think this is going to play out? And how important do you think this election is for the West and Russia?
Yeah, obviously with the polling being contested and a bit unsure, and obviously the voting results being put into question, it's difficult for me to fully grasp what the internal domestic mood would be in Georgia. I haven't been to Georgia myself. I haven't met many Georgians. It's not something that I can have a big stake on. One thing that I did research, however, is what Georgia offers the world as an international player. Obviously, your story there mentions different international observers and different international governments commenting and sort of putting a stake in the game as to what happened here. And some people might wonder why that's happening. In fact, I wondered why so many international observers would be so interested in this.
Yeah.
And I managed to establish a few things that Georgia kind of offers geopolitically due to its place, due to where it's situated. Yeah. Obviously, it does offer some minerals in the form of like some types of rocks, but I think one of the really, really, really key things is its geographical location on the map. Georgia already has established pipelines for oil and natural gas, greatly useful for Azerbaijan, Turkey, and partially Russia. They also have great Black Sea access, which obviously was a big part of why Ukraine is so important for somebody like Russia, due to its maritime access and also its ability to move troops or transport goods. Another really, really important thing is just Georgian railways, many of which were built during the Russian Soviet era. These Georgian railways establish the shortest route between Europe and Central Asia. They also directly connect to the Black Sea and Russia. And Georgia is in an ongoing effort to modernize these railways to become a transit hub right slap bang in between Europe, Russia, and Asia. One of the things that does make this pretty interesting, I think, is how this fits into the plans of other geopolitical actors. Russia has obviously just been cut off from a lot of the world in terms of trade and in terms of commerce. Those are mostly the same thing, probably exactly. So Russia is obviously looking for other ways to expand its trade and has obviously aligned itself more deeply with certain partners such as China. And Russia will be trying to keep as much of a friendly land border for itself as possible. And obviously it will be keeping its allies' interest in mind, which kind of moves a little bit to why I think somebody like China might be really interested in somewhere like Georgia in the future, as where Georgia sits right in the middle slap bang of its sort of one road initiative of it trying to build this sort of new Silk Road connecting Asia and Europe to expand its trade. This means that global actors might actually be very involved and very invested in where Georgia's future is, while China tries to expand its trade there, while maybe the West tries to maybe quench that, since that sort of rhetoric has been ebbing and flowing up and down, and Russia will obviously it want to expand its trade partners, but also its own trade as well. These factors do make Georgia potentially an important player in geopolitics moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, Georgia is very much, in the borderlands. I think that's one of the reasons why there is so much competition, because it is quite a small country, but it is sort of in a area of the world, the Caucasus and near the Middle East, where it's not so like it's not where one power doesn't dominate as much. It's sort of on the cusp of both Russian and Western influence. And I guess since the end of the Cold War, the West has been trying to extend its influence into especially the post-Soviet republics, given the declining geopolitical power of the USSR. Like when the USSR falls, all this new land becomes available, all these new markets become available for the West to move into and trade and gain influence and expand their defense industries, I guess, or their sort of strategic ability to project their power, for having military bases in Georgia and excluding Russia from Georgia, for example. So yeah, no, I think one of the main reasons definitely is just its positioning in the world. It's in the crossroads over the West and East.
Yeah, sort of going off of your understanding of like the history of the area, you obviously your story mentions a little bit the chance of protest or maybe cooing. What do you think are the odds of that? What are the chances of that? Cutting away a little bit of international, just focusing domestically.
Yeah, well, it's not really spoken about very much in Western media, at least, because obviously the government being couped wouldn't look very good optically by a pro-Western for. It's not the kind of thing they want to report on, and so I think part of the reason we don't hear about that very much in the West is because it's not the kind of thing that Western media would want to report on too much. Although I did see Al Jazeera spoke about the Georgian government at least alleging that they had filed, I think, I think it was multiple, it was at least one, but I think multiple coup plots pre the election during the big protest about the Foreign Agents Bill, and some opposition figures have definitely called for a coup openly. Some have. Georgia does have a history of coups through a protest movement resulting in the current government being overthrown and replaced with a new government, which is very pro-Western and Western friendly, and that protest movement being largely fueled by Western media and the West and the civil society in Georgia, which obviously it's not a puppet of the West, but it is very, very influenced by the amount of money and power Western NGOs have. So that kind of mechanism, like in 2003 in the Rose Revolution, definitely is on the table for leading. It could lead to a coup. It does seem less likely now because generally in country the government learns from its mistakes, and when you in terms of revolutions, for example, often when a revolution does happen, it's because the government that's in power during the revolution is quite blindsided. It's not really thinking about it. It's not like taking it's not covering the basis it has to cover. So yeah, for that reason, I feel like it's maybe a bit less likely.
I think also there's a factor that Georgia has faced pressure from Russia for aligning itself more Western or for cooing its governments.
I feel like it's quite characteristic of Russia and the way the pressure is applied. So yeah, the Western pressure, like we just mentioned, of course, that's more very soft pressure. That's more of using their money and influence. But Russian pressure isn't like that because Russia's not got that big economy or that much influence. So yeah, the Russian pressure in Georgia is a lot more hard military. Basically, the threat of potential invasion. I mean, as I mentioned in my sort of intro, Russia currently occupies two regions of Georgia, so Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and Georgia would like to get those regions back for one. And what a big part of the Georgian dreams, sort of, politics is sort of acknowledging, in their mind at least, that the only way we can get these territories back is by normalizing relations with Russia. And if we can do that, then Russia might just give them back as too much hassle, And that definitely, at least a feasible. You can see that logic how that might work. So Russia has a lot of influence that way. It literally has troops in Georgia, and the implicit sort of thing is, if you're more friendly towards us, we might take these troops out and basically allow you to take jurisdiction over these territories. Maybe even like a semi-autonomous basis. Like it's not necessarily like you just let those two territories come back into Georgia, but maybe Georgia would reap the economic benefits or get a PR win, or be able to have access to the markets of its total country and have access to its entire Black Sea coast, for example, which it currently doesn't have because Abkhazia, which makes a good chunk of the Georgian Black Sea coast, is occupied by Russian troops. And also, just quickly to mention, there's of course the threat of Russian escalation. And if Georgia jumps in and starts actively giving weapons to Ukraine, it's one thing if EU countries, which have many countries between themselves and Russia, one thing if they do that, because they're not really a threat from Russia immediately. Russia's not going to invade them, but Russia has invaded Georgia before, and it could invade them again.
Yeah, which is exactly what I was hoping you'd bring up, because I feel like that threat. I'm Polish. In Poland, we hear all the time, the threat of Russian invasion. Even though it's been quite a while since we've been invaded, Georgia has that far more starkly in its recent memory. So I assume it sort of impacts those politics a little bit more. Obviously, that can go both ways. That could make them more anti-Russian or something, but obviously that makes that threat of invasion very, very real.
Yeah, because when you think about Georgia, it actually maybe, if you try to think of any country bordering Russia or any country in the world, Georgia is maybe the most at risk for Russia to actually invade it if they jump into this war. Because every other country bordering Russia is either quite powerful, or it has, in the case of Azerbaijan, powerful backer, being Turkey, for example, and Russia wants to have good relations with Turkey. But in terms of Georgia, the only backers Georgia has are the West. And the West have already shown in Ukraine that if you invade a country which isn't a NATO state, we're not going to jump in and we're going to give you weapons, but we're not going to send ground troops in. And I think Georgia know that, the West know that, and Russia know that with Georgia. So Russia could invade Georgia and already has troops there. So and the Georgian Dream use that as a central part of their electoral their campaign. They had pictures of Tbilisi and Ukrainian cities right next to each other. One destroyed, the other, not destroyed, and that was a big part of their campaign. We don't want to get dragged into the war. They had a lot of rhetoric about the West trying to push them into war and a global war party and whatnot.
So, with the results of the election being currently disputed, what do you think are some of the realistic endpoints for the short term?
Well, it seemed like in terms of the sort of bureaucratic system working itself out, that seems to have came to an end. They've now done the recount and they've now said, oh, look, we did win. And it seems bureaucratically that's the end of the road for that. It seems like the only thing which should happen now, feasibly, in order for this election for the Georgian Dream not to become the government, is for the opposition to overthrow them in protests, which has happened before, but yeah, like we were talking about earlier, I feel like that's quite unlikely because we've already seen massive protests about the Foreign Agents Bill recently, and we've also seen, in response to those protests, the Georgian government having a lot more of a full-on response. They've had a lot of riot police. They barred up the Georgian parliament. I went to Georgia and I saw the big walls. It's not a very welcoming place anymore. It looks a bit like a fort. And I can imagine when they know the protests are coming, they will send a lot of riot police and have it's like a fenced area. So you need a serious attempt to breach that parliament. A more serious attempt than happened in the Rose Revolution, where the government were a bit taken off guard, and you'd also need big enough protests.
And since we already discussed that the Western countries are unlikely to sort of be willing to be ready to fund that or to put their sums so high behind that, because we don't think that their democratic peoples would support it, chances are whatever protests are happening and whatever protests will happen probably won't amount to the level of a coup. Maybe some pressure on the government for future policy, but not enough to sort of dissolve it and put in the opposition.
Yeah, there is a lot of pressure in the government, a massive amount of pressure in the government. There has been a massive amount of pressure in the government for the last 2 years, really, especially in the last 6 months in the Foreign Agents Bill. But I feel like the government has sort of said, okay, the opposite's happened. They've not been like, we're going to do what you want. They've been like, okay, no, we're going to double down. We're going to introduce this Foreign Agents Bill, and we might even potentially rig elections if that is what happened against you, and not even let you come near power. We're not even going to have a close election. We're going to win this election. Theoretically, if they did rig the election, which I have no idea, maybe they could well have not rigged the election, but if they did rig the election, I think that could well have been why they've done it, because a government on the defence who's apparently filed coup attempts only with a month leading up to the election might have a bit of incentive to then rig that and make sure that that's not going to be a close election. So no, I feel like going forward it seems unlikely. It seems like the opposition very much want to, and now they've said post the election they very clearly said we want to overthrow this government in protests. But yeah, I wasn't if you asked me that question right after the election, I would have said I'm not sure. because if there were massive protests after the president called and protests, then maybe it could have worked. Maybe it was massive. Maybe if I don't know. Maybe if the police were a bit like badly organized that day. Maybe if like the weather was there. I don't know. I feel like there's so many factors. In that moment, there's so much in those couple of days. You just don't know what's gonna happen in a revolution situation like that.
That is interesting. I suppose just as a closing thought of my own, it is interesting what you mentioned there about the Georgian government's reaction to people maybe pushing back against their bills or pushing back against their agenda, where they seem to be like doubling down on a lot of it. I wonder if after they feel more secure in their place, if over the course of their term they will try to appease some of those opposing sides, or if in turn they will continue trying to crack down on them, which can either spark up a stronger response, or just make all these people disheartened and crushed and pushed out the way of politics. And I suppose that mostly wraps up our thoughts. That covers everything you need. And so thank you for listening, listener. This was our episode of Contrast Media with me, Patryk Witkowski.
And me, Brent Francis.
Thank you for listening.
See you.